In the quiet town of Willow Creek, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, Emily and Daniel Harper were the couple everyone admired. They had been married for 15 years and were raising 2 children, Sophie and Liam, in a picturesque suburban home. Daniel was a successful accountant known for his sharp mind and meticulous attention to detail. Emily, on the other hand, was the epitome of a devoted homemaker, always seen with a warm smile and a kind word for everyone she met. Together, they appeared to be the perfect family, the kind that people pointed to as an example of marital bliss. But behind the carefully curated facade, cracks were beginning to show. Daniel's controlling nature, once subtle, had grown more pronounced over the years. He monitored Emily's every move, from her spending habits to her social interactions. What started as occasional criticism soon turned into constant belittlement. Emily, who had always been outgoing and confident, found herself shrinking under the weight of Daniel's expectations. She stopped seeing her friends, fearing his disapproval, and even her interactions with her children became strained as she tried to shield them from the tension at home. Friends and family noticed the change in Emily. She had become quieter, more withdrawn, her once vibrant personality dulled by the constant stress of living under Daniel's scrutiny. When asked if everything was all right, she would force a smile and insist that she was fine, but the shadows under her eyes told a different story. Those closest to her began to worry, but no one dared to intervene, not wanting to intrude on what they assumed was a private matter. The breaking point came one evening in late November. The children were staying with their grandparents, leaving Emily and Daniel alone in the house. What began as a seemingly innocuous conversation about household expenses quickly escalated into a heated argument. Daniel's voice grew louder, his words sharper, as he accused Emily of mismanaging their finances. Emily, who had endured years of his criticism, finally snapped. She tried to defend herself, but Daniel's rage only intensified. In a moment of desperation, she grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, her hands trembling as she held it out in front of her. What happened next was a blur. Daniel lunged at her, his face contorted with anger, and Emily, acting on instinct, thrust the knife forward. The room fell silent as Daniel staggered back, clutching his chest. Emily dropped the knife, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she watched him collapse to the floor. Panic set in as she realized the gravity of what she had done. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers slipping on the screen as she dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Emily's voice was barely a whisper as she begged for help, her words choked with tears. By the time the police arrived, it was too late. Daniel lay lifeless on the floor, and Emily was found kneeling beside him, her hands stained with blood. She was arrested on the spot, her pleas of self-defense falling on deaf ears. As the officers led her away, she kept repeating the same words over and over. "I just want to go home." But home, as she knew it, was gone. The perfect life she had built with Daniel had shattered in an instant, leaving behind a trail of questions and a community in shock. Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning of a story that would unravel in ways no one could have predicted. The night of November 12th was cold and still, the kind of night where the air feels heavy with unspoken tension. Inside the Harper household, the silence was deafening. The children, Sophie and Liam, were staying with their grandparents, leaving Emily and Daniel alone in the house for the first time in weeks. The absence of the kids seemed to amplify the unease that had been building between the couple for months. Emily moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps barely audible on the hardwood floors. She had spent the day cleaning, trying to distract herself from the growing dread that had taken root in her chest. But no amount of scrubbing or organizing could erase the tension that hung in the air. Daniel had been in a particularly foul mood all day. He had come home from work earlier than usual, his face set in a grim expression that Emily had learned to fear. He barely acknowledged her as he walked through the door, tossing his coat onto the couch and heading straight to the kitchen. Emily followed him, her heart pounding as she tried to gauge his mood. She knew better than to ask what was wrong. Daniel hated when she pried, but the silence between them was unbearable. Finally, she broke it, her voice trembling as she asked if he wanted dinner. What started as a simple question quickly spiraled into a full-blown argument. Daniel's voice rose as he accused Emily of wasting money on groceries, his words cutting through her like a knife. She tried to defend herself, but her protests only seemed to fuel his anger. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers, and for the first time Emily felt a surge of fear that she couldn't ignore. She backed away, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as she tried to steady herself. But Daniel didn't stop. He kept coming, his voice growing louder, his words more venomous. In a moment of sheer desperation, Emily's hand brushed against the handle of a kitchen knife. She didn't think, didn't plan, she just acted. The blade flashed in the dim light as she raised it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Daniel froze, his eyes widening in shock, but it was too late. Emily thrust the knife forward, the motion almost involuntary. The room seemed to hold its breath as Daniel stumbled back, his hands clutching at his chest. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his crisp white shirt as he collapsed to the floor. Emily stood frozen, the knife slipping from her hand and clattering to the ground. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She dropped to her knees beside Daniel, her hands hovering over him as if she could somehow undo the damage. But it was no use. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, his chest still. Panic surged through her as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers slipping on the screen as she dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Emily's voice was barely a whisper, choked with tears as she begged for help. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the quiet street. They found Emily kneeling beside Daniel's body, her hands and clothes stained with blood. She didn't resist as they handcuffed her, her eyes vacant as they led her to the patrol car. As the door closed behind her, she whispered the same words over and over, "I just want to go home." But home, as she knew it, was gone. The life she had built with Daniel had ended in a single violent moment, leaving behind a trail of questions and a community in shock. The night of November 12th would forever be etched in her memory, a haunting reminder of the night everything changed. The days following Daniel's death were a whirlwind of chaos and confusion. Emily was taken into custody, her arrest sending shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Willow Creek. The initial police report painted a grim picture. A domestic dispute turned deadly, with Emily as the prime suspect. But as detectives began to dig deeper, they realized the case was far more complicated than it first appeared. The investigation quickly became a race to uncover the truth, with every new piece of information raising more questions than answers. Detectives started by interviewing friends and family, hoping to piece together the dynamics of the Harper marriage. What they found was a stark contrast to the perfect image the couple had projected. Friends revealed that Daniel had always been controlling, but his behavior had grown increasingly erratic in recent months. Emily, once vibrant and outgoing, had become a shadow of her former self, her spirit crushed under the weight of Daniel's demands. Neighbors reported hearing frequent arguments, though no one had ever suspected things would escalate to violence. As the investigation progressed, attention turned to Emily's past. A routine background check uncovered a startling revelation. A decade earlier, Emily had been involved in a volatile relationship that ended with a restraining order. The man in question had accused her of being unstable, but the charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. This discovery raised red flags for investigators. Was Emily prone to violence, or had she been a victim in both relationships? The answer wasn't clear, but it added a new layer of complexity to the case. The most damning evidence, however, came from the crime scene itself. A forensic examination revealed defensive wounds on Daniel's hands, suggesting a struggle had taken place. But it was the discovery of bruises on Emily's body that shifted the narrative. Hidden beneath her sleeves and along her ribs were marks consistent with long-term abuse. These injuries, combined with a series of threatening text messages from Daniel, painted a picture of a woman pushed to her breaking point. Emily's claims of self-defense began to gain credibility, but the investigation was far from over. Just as the case seemed to be leaning in Emily's favor, a shocking twist emerged. A neighbor came forward with a startling account. Just days before the murder, they had seen Emily arguing with a mysterious man outside the Harper home. The man was described as tall and broad-shouldered, with a demeanor that suggested he was no stranger to confrontation. Detectives were baffled. Who was this man and what was his connection to Emily? Was it his connection to Emily? Was he an accomplice? Or was there another explanation? The revelation sent the investigation into overdrive. Detectives scoured phone records, social media, and surveillance footage, searching for any trace of the mysterious man. Their efforts paid off when they identified him as Daniel's estranged brother, Marcus Harper. Marcus had a history of run-ins with the law, including charges for assault and fraud. When questioned, Marcus admitted to meeting with Emily but claimed it was to discuss Daniel's gambling addiction, a secret the brothers had kept hidden for years. According to Marcus, Daniel had been spiraling out of control, and Emily had reached out for help. This new information cast a shadow of doubt over the case. If Daniel had been struggling with a gambling problem, it could explain his increasingly erratic behavior. But it also raised questions about Emily's motives. Had she been trying to protect her family, or was there more to the story? As detectives continued to unravel the tangled web of lies and secrets, one thing became clear. The truth was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The case of Emily Harper was no longer just about a single night of violence. It was a story of love, betrayal, and the lengths people will go to protect the ones they love. The trial of Emily Harper began on a cold, gray morning, the courtroom packed with curious onlookers and reporters eager to capture every detail. The case had become a media sensation, with headlines speculating on Emily's guilt or innocence. As the proceedings got underway, the tension in the room was palpable. Emily sat at the defense table, her face pale and drawn, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked like a woman who had been through hell, and in many ways she had. The prosecution wasted no time in painting Emily as a cold-blooded killer. They presented the knife as the murder weapon, emphasizing the brutality of the act. They argued that Emily had planned the murder, pointing to the mysterious man seen arguing with her days before the crime as evidence of premeditation. The prosecutor's voice was sharp and accusatory as he described Emily as a woman who had grown tired of her marriage and saw murder as the only way out. It was a compelling narrative, one that left the jury visibly unsettled. But Emily's defense team was ready to fight back. They painted a very different picture, one of a woman pushed to the brink by years of abuse. They called witnesses who testified to Daniel's controlling behavior, describing how he had isolated Emily from her friends and family. A domestic violence expert took the stand, explaining the psychological toll of long-term abuse and how it could lead to a moment of desperate self-defense. The defense also presented the bruises on Emily's body and the threatening text messages from Daniel, evidence that seemed to support her claims. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Emily herself took the stand. Her voice trembled as she described the night of the murder, her words halting as she relived the horror of that moment. She spoke of the fear she had felt, the way Daniel's rage had consumed him, and how she had acted purely out of instinct. Her testimony was raw and emotional, leaving many in the courtroom in tears, but the prosecution was relentless, cross-examining her with a barrage of questions designed to undermine her credibility. They pressed her about the mysterious man, insinuating that she had conspired with him to kill Daniel. Emily denied it, but the damage was done. The jury was left to weigh her words against the prosecution's accusations. Just when it seemed the trial couldn't get any more dramatic, a bombshell revelation turned everything on its head. Marcus Harper, Daniel's estranged brother, was called to the stand. Under oath, Marcus admitted that he had been blackmailing Daniel over his gambling addiction. He revealed that Daniel had been deeply in debt, borrowing money from dangerous people to fuel his habit. Marcus claimed that Emily had reached out to him for help, desperate to save her family from financial ruin. The prosecution tried to discredit Marcus, pointing to his criminal record, but his testimony introduced a new element of doubt. If Daniel had been involved with dangerous individuals, could someone else have had a motive to kill him? The trial stretched on for weeks, each day bringing new twists and turns. The jury was faced with a difficult decision. Was Emily a victim who had acted in self-defense, or was she a calculating killer who had taken advantage of her husband's weaknesses? As the closing arguments were delivered, the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. The fate of Emily Harper hung in the balance, and no one could predict how the jury would decide. One thing was certain: the truth was far more complicated than anyone had imagined, and the final verdict would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. The day of the verdict arrived, and the courtroom was packed to capacity. Every seat was filled, and the air was thick with anticipation. Emily sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles white. She had spent weeks in a state of emotional turmoil, her future hanging in the balance. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable, and the judge called for order. As the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict, the room seemed to hold its breath. "Not guilty." The words echoed through the courtroom, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then the room erupted. Emily's supporters burst into tears of relief, while others shook their heads in disbelief. Emily herself seemed to collapse under the weight of the verdict, her body trembling as she buried her face in her hands. It was over. After months of uncertainty, she was free. But as the reality of the verdict sank in, it became clear that freedom came with its own set of challenges. The town of Willow Creek was divided. Some saw Emily as a victim who had finally escaped an abusive marriage, while others believed she had gotten away with murder. The media frenzy only added fuel to the fire, with headlines speculating on the jury's decision and what it meant for the justice system. Emily returned home to her children, but the life she came back to was far from normal. The house that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a prison, every corner filled with memories of that fateful night. In the months that followed, Emily struggled to rebuild her life. She sought therapy to cope with the trauma of the trial and the years of abuse she had endured. Her children, Sophie and Liam, were resilient but deeply affected by the loss of their father and the public scrutiny that followed. Emily did her best to shield them from the worst of it, but the scars of the past were impossible to ignore. She found solace in writing, pouring her thoughts and emotions into a memoir that would later become a bestseller. The book shed light on the hidden struggles of domestic abuse, giving a voice to those who had suffered in silence. As time passed, the media attention faded, and Emily began to find a sense of peace. She reconnected with old friends and slowly started to rebuild her confidence. But the shadow of that night never fully left her. She would often wake in the early hours, her heart racing as she relived the moment she had taken Daniel's life. The guilt and grief were a constant presence, a reminder of the price she had paid for her freedom. Years later, Emily's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the line between victim and perpetrator is often blurred. Her case sparked conversations about domestic abuse and the need for better support systems for those trapped in toxic relationships. Emily herself became an advocate, using her platform to help others in similar situations. But despite her efforts to move forward, she could never escape the haunting question that lingered in the back of her mind. Had she truly acted in self-defense, or had she allowed her fear and desperation to take control? The answer, like the truth itself, was complicated. A reminder that some wounds never fully heal. And as Emily looked back on her life, she knew that the night she begged to go home after killing her husband would forever define her, a moment frozen in time that she could never outrun. The story of Emily Harper came to a close, but its echoes lingered in the hearts and minds of those who followed it. Her acquittal marked the end of a legal battle, but it was only the beginning of a long and painful journey toward healing. Emily returned to her children, determined to give them a sense of normalcy, but the weight of the past was a constant presence. The house that had once been filled with laughter and love now felt hollow, a stark reminder of what had been lost. Emily threw herself into rebuilding her life, finding solace in therapy and the support of a few close friends. She channeled her pain into writing, her memoir becoming a beacon of hope for others trapped in abusive relationships. Through her words, she found a way to reclaim her voice, turning her trauma into a tool for change. But the scars of that night never fully faded. Emily would often find herself staring into the distance, her mind drifting back to the moment that had changed everything. The guilt and grief were a heavy burden, one she carried with her every day. She tried to focus on the future, on raising her children and helping others, but the past was always there, a shadow she could never quite escape. Her case had sparked important conversations about domestic abuse and the complexities of self-defense, but for Emily it was a deeply personal story, one that would stay with her forever. As the years passed, the media moved on to other stories and the town of Willow Creek slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. Emily's life became a testament to resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is a glimmer of hope. But the question of whether justice had truly been served remained unanswered. For Emily, the truth was a tangled web of love, fear, and survival, a story that could never be neatly resolved. And as she looked back on her life, she knew that the night she begged to go home after killing her husband would always be a part of her, a chapter she could never fully close. The end of her story was not a conclusion, but a continuation, a reminder that some wounds never fully heal, and some truths are too complex to ever be fully understood.